All right, I guess we can get started. Thank you everyone for coming to the second week of the SciAm Colloquium series brought to you by students here at SciAm. And if you are a student here, we do SciAm and the CSRC through the Discord that I've set up. It's just a great place to talk to other students that we're setting up. Hopefully everybody will be there in the future and be a nice place to communicate. But today, my good friend Eric Medwedeff is joining us. He's a PhD student in the Intelligent Systems Lab at UCI, researching high-performance computing and computational systems biology. He is currently working on developing a high-performance simulator for dynamical graph grammars. Today's presentation will introduce what graph grammars are and how they're going to be used for machine intelligence. And I can't wait to hear about it. Go ahead, Eric.
Thanks, Abe. Hi, I'm Eric, and the title of my presentation is Prospects for Machine Learning Model Reduction for Dynamical Graph Grammars of Complex Biological Systems. So today, I was going through the presentation before and I realized I'm probably going to be talking more about dynamical graph grammars and some of the implementation details than I am about machine learning. But I'm still going to discuss that during the presentation. So I'd like to start off by showing this image here where they have the A, B, C, and D. So this is a microscope image of cells dividing in the apical meristem of a plant cell. And the green right here are the cell walls. And then the red, I believe that's the nucleus of the cells. And so that's image A, showing you kind of like what that looks like. B is actually where we draw what's called a cell complex on that. And that basically gives us the topology for the cell. And then the image C is talking about the cell subdivision. And D is kind of like a refinement to make an estimate of what we expect that the structure of the cell to look like. And so this is kind of like the motivating example for what we're doing. So that being said, so here's the kind of project overview. So basically, an example of what dynamical graph grammars are is a set of rules to basically describe how a system can be represented as graphs and how it evolves and changes over time. So here is a really simplified model where we're representing the microtubules of plant cells as these growing rods. And you can kind of think about that as a bunch of dynamic graphs. So here, the red is the retracting end. The white is the growing end. The other one is the intermediate node. And then the black is where junctions form. And so in order to run these kind of simulations, we actually have to subdivide the domain. And you can kind of see that here on the right, where we're using a two-dimensional plane. And we could basically, in each of these cells, we could put a bunch of microtubules. And we could start trying to simulate what it would look like if microtubules would be growing in like, in this example, you kind of think about it is if you had like a lap slide and it's just kind of like square and you put a bunch of microtubules in it, then you could simulate what you would expect they would do. And this here is a zoomed in image of kind of what it looks like if you had microtubules and you broke up the domain and you kind of had the scales a little bit larger. So you had less microtubules per cell. So this is kind of like an example of what a basic simulation of this would look like, but it can easily get much more complex because on this first slide, this is actually what we're trying to do. And this little zoomed in image of these microtubules is what's basically happening in one of these small cells inside this meristem. So kind of like what I mentioned on the last slide. So dynamical graph grammars are a framework to give us a language to talk about how graphs change over time. And we can talk about the deterministic changes that we have, and we can even talk about the stochastic changes. And we can represent these deterministic changes by using differential equations. And we can represent the stochastic change by using probabilistic rules and things like probability rates. And so if we want to have like a grammar for this, we need to have some sort of language. And the idea of that language implies that there might be some rules for how the language works. So here on I think it's your right, I have an example of what these kind of graph grammar rules look like. So here we have this open circle, which represents an intermediate node. And here we have this closed circle, which represents a growing end. And so what this is basically saying is we have these parameters, which are x1 is position, and u1 is the direction it's facing. x2 is position, again, u2 is direction it's facing. So that's basically saying that this open circle right here is in this position is in this position in space pointing in a direction and is connected by an edge. And so whenever the microtubule has to grow, essentially what you want to do is you want to change the position of the growing end right here. So that's where you have this x2 plus dx2. And so if you wanted to do that in a deterministic way, you could solve a differential equation for that, where the change in the position of this growing end right here that's moving really fast at the bottom is equal to some constant times, in this case, it's 1 over the length that it's currently at over the maximum division length in the direction of that it's pointing. So it kind of, we can even have a more simplified one where it just has a constant and it grows infinitely. And there is basically no change like that. And so this is how you can kind of think about like the moving part of this microtubule down here. And we also have another rule here, which is for positive microtubule overgrowth. So what happens when the microtubule gets too long? Eventually, we need to add another link here. And so that's where we have this open circle and closed circle, these two edges in this graph, or this edge in this graph, will eventually have another edge or node inserted in between this edge with a specific probability. And so this probability function, or I should say in this sense, it's more of a propensity. And if you guys have any questions about that, we can talk about that afterwards. But essentially, propensities and probabilities are slightly different, but sometimes the words used interchangeably. So here we have some sort of sigmoid function where when the difference between the 2 points, when it gets too large, or when it gets very close to this dividing length, we have a higher probability for it to split. And we even have different alternatives we could use instead, like a Heaviside function instead of a sigmoid function. But that's essentially kind of how these dynamical graph grammars work. They give us a way to talk about graphs where we encode not only differential dynamics, but we can also talk about probability. And the mathematical equation for that, so essentially is where we have our simulation algorithm. But I'm not going to get too much into detail here because that's a lot more to unpack. But essentially, it uses this idea of a modified master equation and operating splitting to allow our parallelization. And so essentially, what this master equation does is it's kind of like a rate matrix that allows you to solve differential equations and probability functions. Basically do that simultaneously, so you can determine the growth rate and then you can also determine the events that occur. And so what we realized is, well, when you're dealing with these events happening in space on this small scale, so actually let me explain this image here on the right first to give it a little bit more perspective. So here, this image on the right is a cell complex of the domain. And so each of these, so it's kind of like this image right here, except I have just a graph that represents the topology overlaid to it. But essentially, that's so like in each of these blue cells, those are the interior of the domain that's subdivided. And we realized that if we're doing things on a small scale where there's a lot of reactions happening in here, typically the reactions happening in there don't affect the reactions happening in some far off corner. And so we realized that we can actually do some different kind of parallelization there. So we can basically simulate each of these cells separately from each other. And why you would want to do that? So this is just a zoomed in image that I made. It shows how there's a lot of stuff in this bottom right image. And so if you know, it kind of shows that maybe it's a good idea to parallelize it. Or if we go back all the way to the first slide, if you think that there are a lot of microtubules here, and those are just a small part of one of these cells over here, that if you wanted to simulate these all at the same time, you'd want some sort of method where you could figure out what dynamics are happening in one of these cells, separate from one of these cells, but make sure that you kind of take into account what kind of, any sort of coupling that they may have, because they're still connected, but things happen at different rates. Yeah, and so in order to do this, we designed a parallel simulation algorithm I'm still working on, and we're using parallel and performance portable code written using the libraries Cocos and Cabana. Essentially, those are two libraries that are joint projects from the national labs that allow for easy parallelization of code without having to get into the details of OpenMP and everything. And we also plan to have some future scalability through MPI. And so this image just kind of shows you how the network image here on the bottom left shows you kind of how Cocos is meant to work, or give you a visualization. Essentially, it allows you to do parallelization on a specific node in a cluster. And if you want to do parallelization along a lot of cluster, or a lot of nodes in a bigger cluster, you use MPI. So that being said, I'm going to talk briefly about the future in machine learning and reduced models, and then I'm actually going to go circle back to get into a little bit more detail about what I'm actually doing to get this parallel simulation to work. And feel free, if you guys have any questions, to chime in at any time, because there's kind of a lot going on here, and I know that it was hard for me to find a condensed way to talk about it. So essentially, the idea is we want to simulate these biological systems in parallel, and we want to describe the dynamics of the systems using graphs, including the domains and how those work. And so that's going to produce a lot of data, and it's going to be a lot of graph data and other observables. And there's a bunch of different models we can pick from. We can use graph convolution, neural networks, etc. But the idea is we want to take those models and take that data, and we're in a reduced form of it, so we can A, make it run faster on smaller computers, and B, be able to understand what potential dynamics could lead to a certain outcome. Because the problem right now with biology is, well, when it comes to plant cells, they know that microtubules take place. They're important for figuring out how cells divide. And they have several theories for how the microtubules contribute to cell division, but there isn't actually a full understanding of the mechanism that leads to cell division via the microtubules. So the idea is, if we could simulate a bunch of different possibilities, we might actually have a better chance of helping those biologists figure out more of the inner workings of cells. And also the biggest part is reduced models will, in the long term, help us reduce computational cost and complexity. And the complexity part, hopefully I'll be able to kind of explain how that works in. So this is kind of the high level overview of what I'm working on. We have this biology happening in this first step, and what we need to do is encode biology into dynamical graph parameters. Basically a way to describe biological systems with graphs that have dynamics, and have a base syntax that we can use to give us kind of an understanding of how those rules and stuff work, so we can more easily translate a wide class of models into computer simulations. And those computer simulations need to rely on things like domain decomposition and understanding of the topology of basically the structure that we're working with. So we can get maximum parallelism, and then we want to take those results and we want to plug them into a machine learning model, so we can try to infer something interesting from it. And so where I'm mostly at in my research is the computer simulation phase, because the biology part is very complicated. The grammar part is very complicated. But the most important thing in order to merge all this stuff together is figuring out how we can make a scalable parallel simulation so we can run it on whatever computers we can get our hands on. So this is a little bit of the technical simulation details. It might be kind of unorganized, but feel free, again, to stop, ask some questions. So kind of I wanted to introduce the idea of meshes and grids and all that stuff. So, and to kind of relate that to how this is important to understanding how to parallelize these kind of problems. So essentially, structured meshes are meshes that have structures to them. So here, this cubical grid is basically, a bunch of cubes that are tiled next to each other. And the thing about these kind of structured meshes is it's really easy to determine what the topology is, or like how things are connected, because it's encoded implicitly or explicitly in the structure. So like, for example, if I wanted to know what cell I was next to, I would just have to look over one. Yeah, basically, so I didn't include in this slide, but there's actually a Cartesian product of cell stencils you can use that easily lets you navigate through this structured grid space. And these structured grids are commonly used for things like neighborless computations, which I try to discuss, and things like MPI domain decomposition, and even more using to solve partial differential equations. You can solve them on these grids. But those grids can have different kinds of structures. Like we have a grid here that's more a rectilinear grid. But on the other hand, we also have things like unstructured grids. And this is where it gets really complicated. So unstructured grids, they don't store topological information in the geometric structure. And so the only way to understand and know the relationships is you actually have to have some mechanism to describe those. You can't necessarily use some sort of Cartesian product or anything like that to figure out who your neighbors are. And so these common methods for generating unstructured grids are these Voronoi diagrams, surface triangulation, where you basically take a point and you try to figure out they're on the surface, and then you draw a bunch of triangles. And then one of my more favorite ones is the domino pattern. So essentially, when you have these unstructured grids, how do you know who you're connected to? How do you know what you're next to? And that's important for determining things like communication patterns. And in my case, what I told you is in the beginning, so if you look at this Voronoi diagram, and then we go all the way back to the first slide, you'll actually see a Voronoi diagram. And so if you want to talk about how do we communicate between changing cells in this growing and basically in this growing plant stem, we have to have some way of determining the topology. And that, unfortunately, is really up to you when you're generating this unstructured grid. And so that kind of leads into this other idea. I don't know if this is a good example, but there's also adaptive grids. And those grids are grids that change. Or they can have different sizes for basically, like you can vary the kind of basically the way you want to break up the domain. And in this case, we have simplicial complexes that can actually be used to represent the topology here. And what a simplicial complex is is a complex that describes the topology of how triangles are connected to each other. Well, in 2D, how triangles are connected to each other. So that's basically, yeah, okay. And so we have these classifications. We have structured grids, we have unstructured grids, we have adaptive grids. And now we have one of my more favorite ones, which is a rectangular grid or a brick wall grid. And why this is important is because this is one of those structures where you can kind of, you could use geometry. It's the connectivity is encoded in the geometry, but it's a little bit more difficult to figure out. And so this is the kind of domain decomposition I'm using in my simplified problem, is this rectangular brick wall pattern. And the reason to do that is based on potential efficiency improvements, because in a brick wall, if you look at the interior cell, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 neighbors. But if we go back to this one right here, if you look at these, in interior cell, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 neighbors. So 8 cells are touching in this 2D slice of this 3D grid, versus in this brick wall, you only have 6. And so you can use this kind of sort of modular arithmetic to get these relationships. And the cell boundaries and relations can be gathered to construct a cell complex. And so this is the general idea. Basically, a cell complex is like a graph representation of a grid. And from my experience, I found that this is kind of an idea that's more hidden in software, but not really discussed properly, which is kind of a shame, because it's a really cool idea that's very important for understanding arbitrarily how, basically how domains and all that stuff work. So essentially, it's a really cool, powerful way to encode how our domain works. And essentially, the cell complex can be used to help us do something which is called a spatial hash. And the spatial hash is what helps us generate this thing called a cell list. And that is something that kind of helps us solve one of these very difficult computer science problems, which is subgraph isomorphism. And so I've mentioned before that I'm researching dynamical graph grammars, and I need to essentially, when you define a set of rules and you set of grammars for how these graphs work, you also need to, when you're running the simulation, be able to find occurrences where that graph is, or where that that rule relating to that graph pattern is. So all the way back into this slide about the rules. So we want to be able to, when we're running our simulation, search for all patterns that look like this, so we can transform them to this. Here, it's just an update of parameters, but here, we actually have to insert a node into the graph. And so we have to do what's called a graph rewrite. And so that essentially finding these occurrences is in some way solving a subset of the subgraph isomorphism problem. And so in order to do that, first we need to establish a cell complex, and then we need to establish a cell list. And keep in mind, there could be many other ways to do this, but this is kind of how you might get around to finding an algorithm to do this. And so essentially the idea is, given some sort of domain, you can partition that domain into a bunch of cells. And basically those could be like the size of some sort of reaction distance. And what you do is you say, oh, well, if this point belongs within this point in space, then essentially we put it through a function which assigns it to a place in space. And that's this idea called a spatial hash. And I probably should have fleshed that out a little bit more. But if you guys are interested, I can actually give you the resource in this book that actually talks about the concept of spatial hashing. It's pretty useful if you're doing anything with molecular dynamics or you want to find neighbor lists. But essentially the idea is a cell list is a way to figure out, it's a way to maintain the neighboring points that are next to you. And so like here on the right, if I say had a bunch of particles, I want to find the neighbors for say particle I that are within a specific distance of it. So what I would do is I would actually basically I would search through all the neighboring cells that are next to me, and I would try to find points that are within a specific radius, and then I would bin those points by that place in space, and then I could have a list so I could always more easily find the things that are next to me. And by doing that, I can actually now get closer to finding all of the pieces of graphs that are close to me in space. And that kind of leads me into this next part, which is still, this is where I'm currently working. It's the idea of dynamic graphs and dynamic matrices. Because basically dynamic graphs are things that can change over time. That means they can have changes related to topology, edges, vertices, which basically means that if you had a geometry like a cell that was like being contoured, that basically was changing, morphing over time, you could actually use the cell complex to represent still, even if the shape of the cell changes, you can still have a way to represent the connectivity of everything. So basically dynamic graphs give you the ability to do all that stuff. But dynamic graphs can actually also be represented as dynamic matrices. And you probably have heard of how graphs can be encoded as matrices at some point. But what I'm actually trying to do is take that a step further. And instead, because there are graph representations of matrices, but typically what they don't talk about is dynamic representations of graphs as dynamic matrices. So that kind of means that like if a graph can be dynamic, a matrix can be dynamic. So that would mean that like if you had a 2x2 matrix, you could have some sort of mechanism for it becoming a 4x4 matrix. So the reason why this is all important is because when you add and remove things to a graph, you have to have space to put the new nodes and edges. Just like if, so basically, when you're adding new things or removing things to a graph, you have to have a place to put those edges. Now, normally with this, and I'm sorry if this is getting a little bit too confusing, but essentially the best graphs normally are represented on a computer using things like dense adjacency matrices or linked lists, or this idea that you might have heard about, which is compressed sparse row. So here on the right, we have an image of what compressed sparse row is. We essentially have this graph, and we can represent all the nodes, and we can represent all the edges, and we can store them in this compressed way. But when you do that, you have no way to insert or remove new edges. And so the solution to that is a dynamic CSR. And this is something that I was recently researching, but what I'm actually doing right now is something that's even more dynamic than this. But essentially the idea is if you can represent a graph as a sparse matrix, or you represent a graph as a matrix, that means you can do matrix math using graphs, or matrix math for graphs. And so that means if you have a way to represent a dynamic graph with a matrix, and you can have the ability to update the matrix as the graph changes and resize it and everything, then you have a dynamic matrix, which means that you will also have full compatibility for any matrix operations, which means there is a lot of room for parallelization and basically high performance computing. So that's kind of where I'm going to leave the talk right now, but kind of got a little bit all over the place in the end. Anyways, do you guys have any questions?
Thanks, Eric. That's good. I do have quite a few questions.
Yeah.
I think going back at the start, so when you're sort of dividing up the cell, have you, and so does that software you're using like automatically partition the graph for you, or what is the software you're using doing?
Oh yeah, so this isn't something I've done, but this is essentially, yeah, there's a piece of software that takes in an image of the cell, does some cool computer vision stuff with it, and essentially creates this mesh.
And then, yeah, on the next slide, when you want to divide up, I can't remember. Next one. One more, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, so when you want to divide up these cells in the right, are you like the Cocos and Kibana software? Is that automatically like partitioning the cells for you to parallelize?
No.
Okay.
And actually, yeah, that's something I should have made a little bit more clear. So Cocos essentially is a library that lets you abstract away the syntax of things like CUDA and OpenMP, and it will automatically parallelize the loop for you. So essentially, it gives me the mechanism to write parallel code, but the specific algorithm and doing this stuff is up to me. Kibana is what provides this thing called an array of structures of array, which gives you a way to have more parallel efficient computations when you know the data you're doing a computation on is next to each other in memory, or when you know you can use it in a very compact way.
Mm-hmm. And have you looked? I know there's software out there that automatically partitions graphs. I don't know how useful that would be for you.
Yeah, it'll be not so useful because the kind of idea is I have to, based on some set of parameters, generate a cell complex for a domain. And so, yeah, at this level, there's not really any need for me to use a software to do that, but maybe at some time in the future.
Yeah, and then more on the math side of it. So how do you deal with the boundaries on these cells? Because I know you said you had coupling between the cells.
It's a good question. So essentially, what we're doing in our algorithm is we're trying to do the computation so that we do all the things that are in the interior of the cell first, and then we do all the things that are on the overlapping part, and then what we do is all the things that are on the three-way overlapping. So essentially, the idea is to process some some reactions out of order, and take that error into account, and then later correct it if we have to. Yeah.
And then how would have you thought about this when it translates into matrices as what you hope to do?
Yeah, so that is kind of yeah, haven't thought too far into that. Just the key thing is knowing that graphs and matrices can be interchanged, and so can dynamic graphs and matrices. So that means that, like, if I say had some output from the simulation, I could basically use those standard graph algorithms to, like, what is it? So basically, you know, if you multiply a matrix by, or if you multiply a graph matrix, a graph adjacency matrix by itself, you can actually find what it's connected to. So there are different kind of things you can do. It's just, it's like a bonus, I guess.
Interesting.
So yeah, just to prove that there's like a little bit of math that can be linked to what's going on.
Right. Sounds like a lot of tedious indexing.
Yeah, don't even get me started. Like, there are something I didn't put on this image, but inside of these blue cells is another one of these cell complexes, except it's even smaller.
What's the resolution? So just like one more, or
Yeah, you can have one more. It really is going to ultimately depend on the scale of space that the problem exists in. But right now, a lot of this is still theoretical.
Mhm.
You know, this is still like, this is what we think is what we should do. And so you would have this lower resolution or this higher resolution grid, I guess, that would help you find near neighbors of these graphs right here. And then you'd have an even finer resolution that you could use to solve differential equations on.
Okay. And then what you're hoping for is to get some macro properties of the cell, essentially.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the idea is if those match up to what's observed in reality, maybe something right is happening.
Oh, very interesting. I'm mostly excited about the graph to matrices part of it. That sounds quite cool.
Yeah, the actually one of the cool parts is there are like 1 or 2 papers that talk about that. So it's still like not really a well researched topic, which is good.
Yeah, I can imagine it's quite difficult. Is there any other questions in the audience?